Let's dive into this. What does it mean when God says yes, but not yet? The first sign could be that your heart is ahead of the season you're currently in. Maybe you're younger and you desire marriage. That desire could very well be from God, but you'll likely need to wait for the right time. Or maybe you've been hurt in a past relationship and you long to be in a healthy new relationship. That desire might be from God too, but you may need to heal first. Or perhaps you want to marry a specific person. God may have placed that desire on your heart, but you both need to grow as a couple before taking that next step. An example of how God sometimes gives us a glimpse of what He's calling us to in the future can be seen in the life of Joseph. In Genesis 37:1-11, Joseph had two dreams where he saw himself ruling over his brothers. But immediately after, in Genesis 37:12-36, his brothers overpowered him and sold him into slavery. This must have been confusing for Joseph, especially considering the timing of his dreams. How could God be calling him to lead, and yet he was thrown into slavery by the very people he thought he would lead? It's easy to imagine him questioning whether what he had seen in his dreams was truly from God. However, when we look at the details, we see that Joseph was only 17 years old when these events occurred. When you keep reading, it becomes clear that it was probably about 20 years later when Joseph's dream was actually fulfilled. This shows us that God had said yes to Joseph, but it wasn't yet time. Just like Joseph, we too often have to wait for the right season. Sometimes God gives us a glimpse of the future to help motivate us during the tough times, much like how He gave Joseph those dreams when he was 17, perhaps to encourage him through the hardships he would face. The second sign that God might be saying yes but not yet is if you will be used more effectively later on. Perhaps you're ready for marriage, but your future spouse isn't. Maybe God is waiting until that person is ready to recognize you, or until they've gone through necessary experiences to realize just how much they need you. A key part of Joseph's story involves the famine. While Joseph was stuck in prison yet thriving because God was with him, God gave Pharaoh a dream that no one could interpret. Joseph was the one chosen to interpret it, revealing that there would be 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Finally, God used Joseph's position to prepare for the famine. When Joseph's family finally came to Egypt, seeking help, Joseph was in the perfect position to save them. When he revealed his identity to his brothers, he said, "It was not you who sent me here, but God." Like Joseph, God has an important purpose for your life, and He will prepare you for things you can't yet see. It's important to remain faithful, even when you don't understand His full plan. God knows what's ahead, and if you stay faithful, He will bring His plan to fruition. The third sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're holding on to a biblical promise. God hasn't promised all of us spouses, wealth, or prosperity. However, He has promised that if we lose our lives for Him, we will gain eternal life. He also said that if we give up earthly things, we will receive 100 times as much. Yet, when we go through suffering, it can be tempting to doubt if these promises are true. Joseph likely felt this way in Genesis 48:21, when his father, Jacob, on his deathbed told him, "Behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers." However, this promise wasn't fulfilled during Joseph's lifetime, but that didn't cause him to doubt it. When it was time for Joseph to die, he told his sons, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." Joseph trusted in God's promise that He would deliver His people back to the promised land, even though Joseph wouldn't live to see it. This is an important reminder that there are biblical promises in our lives that we may not experience in the way we expect. But that doesn't mean we should doubt God's faithfulness. Just because a promise isn't fulfilled in the way or timing we anticipated, doesn't mean God's word isn't true. Joseph's unwavering belief in God's promise shows that trusting in God's plan, even when we don't see immediate results, is key to living out His calling for us. Just because we don't see the fulfillment of a promise right now doesn't mean God isn't working behind the scenes. In our own lives, there may be times when we wonder where God's promises are, especially when they seem to be delayed or unfulfilled. But if we look at the bigger picture, we'll see that God's timing is always perfect. He knows when we're ready to receive what He has in store for us. And in the meantime, we are called to trust, wait, and continue living with faith in His promises. just as Joseph did. So, even if you're holding on to a promise and it seems far off, remember that God is always faithful. His promises are sure, and He will bring them to fulfillment in His perfect timing. Like Joseph, we can find peace in knowing that even if we don't experience the fullness of God's promises in our lifetime, He is still working out His plan, and His timing is always best. The fourth sign that God may be saying, yes, but not yet, is if you're in a season of preparation. Just like a seed needs time to grow before it can bear fruit, God often uses seasons of waiting to prepare us for something greater. These waiting periods may feel like a challenge, but they are necessary for building the character, patience, and resilience we need to fully walk into the calling God has for us. Joseph's story is a prime example of this. He spent many years in situations that seemed unfair, such as being sold into slavery and thrown into prison. Yet, during these difficult years, God was preparing Joseph for a significant purpose. His time in prison wasn't wasted. Instead, it was where Joseph's leadership skills were refined and where he learned to interpret dreams, skills that would later prove essential for his role in saving Egypt and his family from famine. Sometimes we may feel like we are stuck or in a season of uncertainty, but it's during these moments that God often does His deepest work in us. Our patience and perseverance are refined when we trust Him in these times. Joseph didn't know the end result, but he trusted that God had a plan for his life. His journey shows that God uses even the most difficult circumstances to prepare us for what He has ahead. This season of preparation can also involve developing the skills and resources necessary for fulfilling the calling God has placed on our lives. For Joseph, that meant learning leadership and wisdom in the most unlikely of places, prison. God often works in hidden ways, teaching us lessons in places where we may least expect them, but they are always purposeful for the future. The key takeaway here is that while waiting may be difficult, it is never wasted. God is preparing you, just as He did for Joseph. Trust that in the waiting, you are becoming the person He wants you to be to fulfill the purpose He has for your life. When the time is right, the preparation will reveal its worth, and you will step into the promise that God has been preparing you for all along. The fifth sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're being prepared for a greater purpose. Often when God gives us a vision or a calling, it's not just about us, but about how He wants to use us to impact others. The season of not yet can be a time where God is working on us, preparing us to serve a greater purpose that will bless many people. What we may see as delays or setbacks might actually be God's way of positioning us for something bigger. Joseph's story continues to show us this principle. He didn't just rise to power for his own benefit. His promotion was part of a larger plan to save many lives, including his own family. When Joseph was in power and his brothers came to Egypt looking for food, he revealed that his purpose was to preserve his family and the nation. He recognized that what he had gone through wasn't just for him, but to fulfill God's greater purpose of saving the lives of many people during a time of famine. This lesson is important for us because sometimes we think that God's promises are only about us, our desires, our dreams, our comfort. But in reality, God's plan often extends beyond our personal benefit to touch the lives of others. The waiting season can be a time of refining, where God teaches us how to serve others and prepare ourselves for the impact He wants us to make. Just as Joseph was positioned to save others, we too may be prepared for a bigger purpose that extends beyond ourselves. God's timing is always perfect, and the not yet season is often when He is preparing us for the impact we will have on others. It's in these waiting periods that we learn the lessons we need to grow in character, humility, and service. Joseph had to endure hardship, but that hardship became the very thing that positioned him to save many lives. So, if you're in a season of waiting, remember that God is preparing you for something greater. The struggles and challenges you face may seem difficult, but they are part of a bigger plan that will ultimately bring glory to God and bless others in ways you cannot yet see. The sixth sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're learning to trust God even when you can't see the full picture. There are times in our lives when we can't understand why things are happening the way they are, or why God is asking us to wait. During these moments, it can be easy to doubt his plan or question whether we will ever see the fulfillment of his promises. However, trusting God when we can't see the full picture is one of the most powerful ways we demonstrate our faith in him. Joseph's story is a powerful illustration of this principle. After he was sold into slavery and thrown into prison, Joseph had no idea what God's ultimate plan was. He could have easily given up or lost faith, but instead, he chose to trust that God was still in control, even when things seemed impossible. His faith and trust in God during those difficult times were instrumental in preparing him for the moment when God would fulfill his promises. Sometimes, God allows us to go through seasons where we don't have all the answers, and we don't understand what he's doing. It's during these times that our faith is stretched and we are invited to trust in his sovereignty. Just as Joseph didn't know the full picture of how God was working through his hardships, we too must trust that God is using our circumstances for a greater purpose, even when we can't see how it all fits together. God often uses these not yet seasons to deepen our trust in him. The waiting period becomes a time of strengthening our faith muscles, learning to rely on God rather than our own understanding. It's a reminder that even when we don't see immediate results or answers, God is still working behind the scenes to fulfill his plan for our lives. So if you're in a season where things don't make sense and you're struggling to trust God, know that you're not alone. Just like Joseph, you can choose to trust God's timing and his plan, even when the path ahead seems unclear. Trust that God is faithful, and in his perfect time, he will bring about the fulfillment of his promises. The seventh sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're learning to let go of control. Many times we want to take things into our own hands and make things happen in our own timing. However, God's timing is often different from ours, and he may be asking us to surrender control and trust him with the outcome. It's in the waiting that we learn to release our desire for control and let God lead the way. Joseph's story again shows us how releasing control can lead to God's perfect plan. Throughout his trials, Joseph didn't try to manipulate situations or force things to go his way. Instead, he trusted God's plan and allowed God to work in his own time. Even when he was falsely accused and thrown into prison, Joseph didn't try to take matters into his own hands. He allowed God to take control, and in the end, God used those circumstances to elevate him to a position of leadership. Letting go of control can be one of the hardest things to do, especially when we feel like we know what's best for our lives. However, God often works in ways that we don't understand, and his ways are higher than ours. Just as Joseph had to trust God with his future, we must trust God with ours and allow him to lead us, even when it's difficult to see the way forward. In the waiting season, God is teaching us to surrender our own plans and desires and align ourselves with his. We may not always understand why things are happening the way they are, but when we trust God's timing and release control, we make space for him to do his work in and through us. Just as Joseph trusted God with his future, we can trust God with ours. If you're struggling to let go of control, remember that you don't have to do it all on your own. God is in control, and when we surrender to him, he will lead us to the right place at the right time. Trust that his plan for your life is far better than anything you could control or plan yourself. The eighth sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're experiencing a season of testing and refining. It's during these times that God refines our character and strengthens our faith. The process of waiting often brings challenges that push us beyond our comfort zone, but it's through these trials that we grow and become more equipped for the purpose God has for us. While it may feel like you're being tested or stretched, it's important to remember that these challenges are an opportunity for God to mold you into the person you are meant to be. Joseph's life is filled with moments of testing and refining. From being betrayed by his brothers to being falsely accused and thrown into prison, Joseph endured many hardships. Yet, it was in these difficult times that God was shaping him into the leader he needed him to be. Each trial that Joseph faced was an opportunity for him to trust God more deeply and to learn to rely on God's strength rather than his own. The refining process wasn't easy, but it was necessary for Joseph's growth. In our own lives, we often face challenges that seem unfair or difficult to understand. However, these moments of testing are not in vain. God uses them to refine our hearts, strengthen our character, and prepare us for the purpose He has for us. Just like Joseph, we may not understand why we're going through certain trials, but we can trust that God is using them for our good and His glory. The key to navigating these seasons of testing is to keep our eyes focused on God and trust in His process. It's easy to get discouraged when things aren't going the way we expected, but God is working in the midst of our struggles. As we lean on Him and trust His plan, we can be confident that the refining process will ultimately lead us to the fulfillment of His promises. If you're in a season of testing, don't lose hope. Just as Joseph's trials led to a greater purpose, your challenges are preparing you for something greater. Trust that God is refining you for the good work He has prepared for you, and keep your faith strong as you wait for His perfect timing. The ninth sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're being asked to develop patience. Patience is one of the most difficult virtues to cultivate, especially when we live in a world that values instant gratification. We often want things to happen quickly, and we struggle when the answers don't come as fast as we expect. However, God uses these waiting seasons to teach us the importance of patience, reminding us that His timing is always perfect. Joseph's life is a testament to the power of patience. Despite receiving a vision of his future success, Joseph had to wait many years before he saw the fulfillment of that promise. During those years, he faced rejection, hardship, and imprisonment, but he didn't give up or lose his faith. Instead, he patiently trusted that God was working in the background, even when he couldn't see the results. His story shows us that patience is a key element in God's plan for our lives. In our own lives, we often face moments where it feels like we're waiting for something that is taking longer than we expected. Whether it's waiting for a career, breakthrough, a relationship to heal, or a prayer to be answered, God is using these moments to teach us patience. Through patience, we learn to trust in His timing and understand that the waiting period is not wasted. God's timing is different from ours, and while we may want things to happen quickly, He knows when the right time is. Just as Joseph had to wait years for the fulfillment of his dreams, we too may have to wait for God's perfect timing. The waiting process is often where God is shaping our character and preparing us for what's to come. When we practice patience, we show that we trust God to provide what we need when we need it. If you're struggling with impatience, remember that God is using this season to strengthen your faith and prepare you for the future He has planned for you. Just as Joseph's patience eventually led him to a position of great influence, your patience will lead you to the fulfillment of God's promises in your life. Trust that in time, everything will unfold according to His perfect plan. The 10th sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're being asked to grow in your dependence on Him. In many situations, God allows us to face challenges and delays to teach us to rely on Him more fully. We often try to solve problems on our own or look to other people or resources for answers. However, God's purpose in the waiting period is to draw us closer to Him so that we learn to trust Him with every aspect of our lives. Joseph's life provides an example of how dependence on God leads to blessings and fulfillment. While in prison, Joseph could have become bitter and relied on his own wisdom to escape. Instead, he depended on God's guidance and trusted that God would use his situation for good. Even when Joseph was in difficult circumstances, he continued to rely on God's direction, which ultimately led him to the fulfillment of his dreams. In our own lives, we may feel tempted to rely on our own strength or to turn to others for help when things are difficult. But God is calling us to place our trust in Him, knowing that He is the ultimate source of provision, wisdom, and strength. The process of waiting helps us learn how to fully depend on God, understanding that our success and breakthrough come from His grace, not our own efforts. Dependence on God also involves surrendering our own plans and submitting to His will. It's a recognition that God knows what's best for us, even when we don't understand why things are unfolding the way they are. Just as Joseph trusted God's plan for his life, we must trust that God is leading us in the right direction, even when we can't see the full picture. If you're struggling with dependence on God, remember that He is faithful, and He will provide for all your needs. Just like Joseph, As you learn to rely on God and trust His timing, you will see the fulfillment of His promises in your life. Keep leaning on Him and surrendering to His will, knowing that He is working all things together for your good. The 11th sign that God may be saying yes but not yet is if you're experiencing a season of preparation. Before stepping into the fullness of the promise, God often requires us to undergo a period of preparation. This time may feel like a waiting period, but it is crucial for equipping us for what lies ahead. During this time, God molds our character, strengthens our abilities, and positions us to handle the blessings that will come. Joseph's journey shows us how preparation is necessary for fulfilling God's purpose. When Joseph was sold into slavery, it seemed like his dreams were far from reality. However, each step of his journey, from being a servant in Potiphar's house to interpreting Pharaoh's dream, was part of the preparation process. Through each experience, Joseph developed the wisdom, humility, and leadership skills he would need to rule Egypt. What looked like a setback was actually a setup for God's greater purpose in his life. In our own lives, we may be in a season of preparation, but it might not look like we expect. The work that God is doing in us behind the scenes may not be immediately visible to others, but it's building a foundation for the future. During this time, it's important to focus on developing the qualities and skills that God is cultivating in us, even if it feels like we're stuck or moving slowly. The preparation period often requires patience and trust. We may be eager for the promise to be fulfilled, but God knows that we need this time to be properly equipped. If we rush through the process, we might not be ready for what lies ahead. Just like Joseph, we can trust that every experience we go through is part of God's preparation for our future. If you feel like you're in a season of preparation, don't be discouraged. God is at work in your life, and this time is necessary for your growth. Stay faithful and patient, knowing that God is preparing you for the purpose He has for you. In His perfect timing, the preparation will lead to the fulfillment of His promises.